Welcome to Nordic Love Stories. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe for more unforgettable Western romance stories. The entire church believed the 19-year-old bride had just lost her freedom forever. But before the wedding day ended, the millionaire cowboy would place a single key in her trembling hands and quietly whisper words no one expected to hear. "Your freedom will always come, before this marriage." In that single moment, the whole town would fall into stunned silence, and the young bride would realize she had married the one man who refused to own her heart. Abigail Foster stood before the old wooden altar with trembling hands hidden beneath worn lace gloves. At only 19 years old, she wore a simple ivory wedding dress borrowed from a kind neighbor because her family could never have afforded one of their own. The lace had been carefully mended, but it still carried the weight of another woman's memories. Every pew inside the small church was filled with the people of Red Creek. Curious eyes followed every movement she made. Some whispered with pity, others with envy, while many simply watched as though they had gathered for entertainment instead of a wedding. None of them knew the truth. 3 months earlier, the Foster ranch had been full of hope until the rain stopped falling. The crops failed, the cattle weakened, and unpaid debts slowly buried her father's dreams. When the bank threatened to take everything, a respected land broker arrived with what he called a solution. Nathaniel Brooks, the wealthiest ranch owner in the valley, wished to marry. Her father believed accepting the arrangement was the only way to save the family home. He cried while telling Abigail, but tears could not change reality. She agreed because watching her younger brothers lose everything would have broken her even more. Across the altar stood Nathaniel Brooks, 35 years old, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark wool coat with his weathered cowboy hat resting quietly in his hands. Abigail expected to see pride, coldness, or the satisfaction of a man buying another person's future. Instead, she found calm eyes filled with quiet understanding. The preacher's voice echoed gently through the little church. "Abigail Rose Foster, do you take this man to be your lawful husband?" Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. Every face waited for her answer. "I do," she whispered, barely, louder than the wind outside. The preacher turned toward Nathaniel. "Nathaniel Brooks, do you take this woman to be your lawful wife?" Nathaniel looked directly at Abigail before speaking. "I give her my word." The unusual answer sent confused whispers through the church. The preacher hesitated for only a moment before completing the ceremony. Husband and wife. The words felt heavy as iron around Abigail's heart. Nathaniel offered his arm without saying a word. She hesitated, then gently accepted. His grip remained, respectful, never demanding. Outside, cold autumn air rushed across the churchyard as golden leaves danced along the dusty road. Nathaniel helped her into the wagon only after she nodded. Throughout the long journey toward Brooks Ranch, silence surrounded them until he quietly broke it. "You don't have to speak today if you don't wish to." Abigail looked at him with surprise. "I'm Mrs. Brooks now," she answered softly. Nathaniel gave a small shake of his head. "Only if that name ever feels like it truly belongs to you." Those words stayed with her all the way to the ranch. When they finally arrived, the house stood proudly against the rolling hills, surrounded by wide pastures, strong fences, and peaceful horses grazing beneath the fading afternoon sun. Nathaniel carried her single suitcase inside and slowly showed her through the warm wooden home. Everything was neat, welcoming, and carefully prepared. Upstairs, he opened a bright bedroom overlooking the eastern meadow. "This room is yours," he said quietly. "The door locks from the inside. Use it whenever you want. I'll never enter unless you invite me." Abigail stared at him, unable to hide her surprise. Before leaving, Nathaniel placed a small polished wooden box on the dresser. "Open it whenever you're ready." He quietly closed the door behind him. Alone at last, Abigail waited several minutes before gathering enough courage to lift the lid. Inside rested a shining brass key tied to a leather tag, and beneath it a folded handwritten note. With trembling fingers, she unfolded the paper and read the words slowly. "This key opens. The small cottage beside the east meadow. It belongs to you alone. Whether you stay for 1 week or a lifetime, every choice inside those walls will always be yours. Abigail read the note again as tears quietly filled her eyes. For the first time since the wedding bells had rung that morning, hope gently found its way into her frightened heart. Abigail read the note again as tears quietly filled her eyes. For the first time since the wedding bells had rung that morning, hope gently found its way into her frightened heart. She held the brass key tightly against her chest before slowly walking toward the bedroom window. The little cottage rested beyond the eastern meadow, surrounded by tall oak trees and a white wooden fence. It looked peaceful, almost forgotten, yet somehow welcoming. She wondered why a man she barely knew would give a stranger a place that belonged only to her. Downstairs, Nathaniel quietly prepared supper. He placed 2 plates on the table, then stepped back when he heard no footsteps. Instead of calling her, he simply covered her meal with a clean cloth to keep it warm. Nearly an hour later, Abigail finally came downstairs. She hesitated at the kitchen doorway. Nathaniel looked up from his coffee and offered a gentle smile. "There's stew if you're hungry." She nodded silently and filled a bowl before sitting. At the opposite end of the table, they ate without speaking. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, it simply needed time. After supper, Nathaniel stood and placed another small key beside her plate. "The pantry," he explained. "Nothing in this house is locked from you." Abigail looked at the key, then back at him. "You trust me?" she asked quietly. Nathaniel answered without hesitation. "Trust has to begin somewhere." The next morning she woke before sunrise and found fresh bread cooling beside the stove. Nathaniel was already outside repairing a broken fence with his ranch hand. Samuel, an older cowboy with kind eyes and a warm laugh. Abigail watched through the kitchen window as the 2 men worked together. Nathaniel noticed her standing there but simply tipped his hat before returning to work. He never expected her to join them. Later that afternoon, Abigail wandered toward the little cottage. The brass key turned easily in the lock. Dust floated through the sunlight, but everything inside had been carefully cleaned. There was a small fireplace, a rocking chair, shelves waiting for books, and a sewing table beside the window. On the mantel rested another folded note. "Every person deserves one place where they never have to ask permission to breathe. I hope this becomes yours." Abigail slowly sat in the rocking chair, reading the note again and again until she realized she was smiling for the first time in months. Over the following days, she began planting wildflowers around the cottage while Nathaniel worked the ranch. Sometimes he rode past and simply waved, before continuing toward the pastures. He never interrupted her quiet moments. One evening, dark clouds rolled across the valley much faster than expected. A violent storm swept over the ranch with fierce wind and heavy rain. Abigail hurried back toward the house but slipped on the muddy path. Before she could fall completely, strong hands caught her. Nathaniel steadied her gently and immediately released her once she found her balance. "Are you hurt?" he asked with genuine concern. She shook her head, breathing hard. Lightning flashed across the sky as thunder echoed through the hills. Without saying another word, Nathaniel removed his own coat and carefully draped it over her shoulders before walking beside her through the rain. When they reached the porch, she noticed he was completely soaked while she remained warm beneath his coat. Before she could thank him, the sound of galloping horses shattered the peaceful evening. Samuel raced into the yard, his horse covered in sweat. He barely climbed down before calling out, "Boss, we've got trouble. 3 armed riders just crossed the north fence and they're heading straight for the eastern meadow, toward the little cottage." Samuel raced into the yard, his horse covered in sweat. He barely climbed down before calling out, "Boss, we've got trouble. 3 armed riders just crossed the north fence, and they're heading straight for the eastern meadow, toward the little cottage." Nathaniel's expression hardened, but his voice remained calm. "Stay inside," he told Abigail. She grabbed his arm before he could leave. "Please, be careful." For a brief moment, he looked into her eyes and gave a reassuring nod. "I promise I'll come back." Without another word, Nathaniel climbed onto his horse and rode into the storm with Samuel close behind. Abigail stood on the porch watching the rain swallow them into the darkness. Every passing minute felt like an hour. Thunder shook the valley, and fear settled heavily in her heart. Nearly an hour later, hoofbeats echoed through the yard again. Nathaniel returned, his coat soaked with rain and a small cut above his eyebrow, but otherwise unharmed. Samuel followed, leading 3 riderless horses behind him. "Is everything all right?" Abigail asked, rushing toward him before stopping herself. Nathaniel smiled faintly. "Everything's fine. They weren't after the ranch." "Then why were they here?" she asked. Nathaniel reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a weathered leather folder. "They were looking for this." Inside were legal papers proving ownership of the eastern meadow and the cottage. Years earlier, a dishonest land speculator had secretly planned to seize that property using forged documents. Nathaniel had uncovered the fraud before the wedding and legally transferred the cottage into Abigail's name, knowing no one could challenge her rights if the truth ever came to light. Abigail stared at him in disbelief. "You gave it to me before we even knew each other?" Nathaniel nodded. "I wanted you to have one place in this world that no one could ever take from you." Tears filled her eyes. No one had ever protected her without expecting something in return. The next morning, news of the failed land scheme spread across Red Creek. By Sunday, the entire town gathered outside the church, whispering about what had happened. After the service, the mayor stepped forward and publicly confirmed that Nathaniel Brooks had exposed the fraud, saved several neighboring families from losing their land, and placed the cottage entirely in Abigail's name without asking for anything in return. The same people who had once judged their marriage now stood in complete silence. Mrs. Dalton slowly approached Abigail and lowered her head. "I misjudged both of you," she admitted quietly. Abigail simply smiled with grace. "Kindness is worth more than pride." Nathaniel looked at her with quiet admiration. As they walked back toward their wagon, he reached into his pocket and handed her one final folded document. Confused, Abigail opened it. It was a deed to the Foster family ranch. Every debt had been cleared months earlier in her father's name, and the land had legally been returned to her family without anyone knowing Nathaniel had paid the entire amount himself. She looked at him with tears streaming down her face. "Why didn't you tell me?" Nathaniel answered with the same quiet honesty that had guided him from the beginning. "Because love isn't measured by what people hear. It's measured by what they never have to fear." Abigail stepped forward, took his hands, and this time there was no hesitation. "When I stood beside you at the altar, I believed I was losing my future," she whispered. "Now I know I was walking toward it." Nathaniel smiled as the church bells rang across the valley. Together they climbed into the wagon and rode home beneath the golden evening sky, no longer strangers joined by circumstance, but 2 hearts that had freely chosen each other, while the people of Red Creek watched in respectful silence, finally understanding that the greatest wedding gift had never been money, land, or wealth. It had always been freedom, kindness, and a love earned through patience.